I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I began my working life in the 1980s, I worked for a time as the research officer for the Auckland team of detached youth workers. And detached youth workers were social workers who worked with young people, who we at that time used to call street kids. And the detached youth workers ranged from being highly competent professional social workers through to people who were actually just people typically associated with churches, I have to say, who actually had no qualifications, no particular skills, just a particular motivation to work with those young people. And the range of quality was extraordinary, from those who did good with the people they worked with to those who did harm. Now, Mr. Speaker, I spent most of my working life in hospitals, in healthcare systems. So I want to pick up where John O'Neill has just left off. In healthcare settings, most of our professions have mandatory registration and mandatory regulation. And social workers are one of very few exceptions to that rule, an inappropriate exception, Mr. Speaker. If someone calls themselves a doctor, we have confidence that that person has appropriate training, has the appropriate skills and knowledge to undertake the particular set of medical work that they're doing. We have confidence that they are experiencing ongoing medical training to keep their skills up to date. Could be a problem for John O'Neill working for the Alzheimer's Society. We have confidence that they work to a mandatory code of ethics. All of that we have confidence in, and that's important, Mr. Speaker. It's important because we need to trust the person who calls themselves a doctor. We need to trust them because of the capacity for harm if they do not perform their job adequately. In the medical setting, it's obvious, isn't it? We would be aghast if someone called themselves a doctor but actually wasn't really registered as a doctor or did not have those qualifications. Completely inappropriate. But, Mr. Speaker, social workers are also so often in the setting where they actually have the possibility of causing harm to the people they work with, because those people are vulnerable. The reason that people are working with a social worker is because they have need, because they are vulnerable, and therefore they need to be able to trust that the person calling themselves a social worker is in fact subject to all of that regulation to assure the quality of the service that they provide. It's a no-brainer, Mr. Speaker. Mandatory registration of social workers is an absolute necessity. My partner is a social worker, and I know that the variability of quality of work that I experienced back in the 1980s continues to this very day, even though we have voluntary registration. Voluntary registration, Mr. Speaker, has not proved to be enough. We need to go mandatory. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish by addressing the argument, if you could call it that, that's been presented by members from the government benches tonight. Essentially, they say, well, we agree with mandatory registration. We agree with mandatory registration, but actually we want to have a review. Well, what's the review going to address, Mr. Speaker? The review is simply going to address the issues that are already canvassed here. And, Mr. Speaker, all of the words that we've heard from the government members will all be blown away. And in the tide of history, what the good social workers will hear tonight is that this government chose to vote against mandatory registration, chose to vote against professional standards for social workers, voted against the issues of great social work.
I call